Hey Jafffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Today is all about brakes on the 200 series Landcruiser. What I've got planned is I'm going to swap out the front and the rear discs, the front and the rear pads. We're going to do a complete flush of the braking system. I am going to use my laptop and the ECU on the car to help with that coolant flush. And we're going to consult our handy dandy warranty and service book that Toyota provide us. But before we do any of this, we're going to have a chemistry lesson. Brakes and chemistry? What the heck? Stick around. Okay, what I've got in front of me here are two Erlenmeyer flasks and a beaker. In that Erlenmeyer, I've got some brake fluid. In that Erlenmeyer, I've got some engine oil. And in the beaker, I've got a bit of water. All right, let's take our engine oil first. Put a little bit of water in the engine oil, not a lot. And this is going to come as no surprise to anybody, but the water is floating on top of that engine oil. The engine oil is hydrophobic, which means it's water hating. And if you stir it around, it might break the little droplets up a little bit, but the water is still floating on top of that engine oil. So what that means in real life is if you've got a component, an engine component, or any metal surface for that matter, coated in engine oil, and you hit it with a little bit of water, there's going to be a barrier between the water and between that metal component because the engine oil is hydrophobic. Okay, let's do the same experiment with a little bit of brake fluid. Pop that in, mix it around, and what do you see? That water has been completely absorbed into the brake fluid. So the brake fluid is what's called hydrophilic or water loving. So let's talk about the same situation. You've got a metal component like a brake pipe that's coated in brake fluid and it comes into contact with a little bit of water. What happens? That water will actually contact that metal component and you'll start to corrode it. And that right there, my friends, is why it's so critically important that you swap out the brake fluid in your car, because it does absorb water, and when it does absorb that water, the components within your braking system will start to corrode. If we consult our handy dandy warranty and service book, Toyota's got this wonderful table that tells us what we have to do and how often we have to do it. And if we have a look at brake fluid where my finger is, it's telling us we want to replace that every 40,000 kilometers. So let me look you in the eye and ask you the question. When's the last time you've replaced the brake fluid on your vehicle? Be it a 200 series or any other car? Yeah, I thought so. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out as much brake fluid out of this reservoir that I can. Even if you don't intend to swap this brake fluid out, it's always a good idea to take a little bit out of this reservoir. Most of your brake systems are going to be up at the max level, but what you'll find when you replace the rotors and the pads is you're going to have to squeeze the brake piston back inside of the caliper, and that's going to force brake fluid back up into this reservoir, and it could actually overflow. So it's always good to pull a little bit out of it anyway, even if your intention is not to swap it out completely. Before I get too far, let's talk about this potential elephant in the room. Toyota is specifying .3 brake fluid in their book, and on the reservoir itself, it says use .3 only as well. I'm going to be using .4 brake fluid. So what's the difference and how can I get away with this? The main difference between .3 and 4 is simply the boiling point, at which point in time that fluid will actually boil. And .4 has a higher boiling point than .3. Now, it is not a good idea to mix the two. So in my instance, because I'm going to be doing a complete flush of the brake system, I'm going to be replacing all of that .3 with .4. The disadvantage of that, of course, is if you sell your vehicle, it now has .4 in the reservoir, but it's got .3 written all over the place. So the next owner of the vehicle could actually put .3 in there thinking it's a .3 system. For me, that's not a real big deal because I intend keeping the car until basically it's a pile of junk or they cover me up. If you're familiar with my maintenance videos, you would have seen me use this pump before. It's just one of those cheap pumps you can pick up off of ePray. oil transfer pump, and it works perfectly fine for brake fluid as well. The large pipe is the delivery side, and the smaller diameter pipe is the suction side. Well, that process pulled about 300 mil out of there, and as you can see, the reservoir is still over half full. There's a little baffle inside of there that won't allow you to get past it to get down and suck into the bottom of that reservoir. It's a bit of a bummer. I was hoping I'd be able to suck most of that out, but I do want to get the rest of that out because I don't want to blend the dot 3 and the dot 4 together. So what I'll do is I'll pull the brake bleeder off on the closest caliper, and I'll just let gravity take the rest of it away. Check that out, eh? Despite the fact that I got underneath of this car with a gurney and an underbody wash after the Fraser Island trip, it still got sand all over the brake components. Unbelievable. All right, I've just cracked that bleeder, put a rubber hose on there, and you can see it's slowly draining out. So I'm going to use gravity to take out 90% of the fluid out of that reservoir. I won't drain it completely because I don't want to get air in the system. Now I'm just using a screwdriver and I'm compressing these caliper cylinders while the caliper's still on. I'm jamming it between the brake rotor and the pad itself. And I wouldn't normally do this, but because I'm replacing both the brake pad and the rotor, then I don't need to worry about damage, of course. And the reason I'm doing this is I don't want that brake fluid that's being forced out of the cylinders in the caliper to be pushed back up into the master cylinder, because I'm going to be draining it anyway, right? Now, holding the caliper on are two 17mm bolts, and they could be a little bit tight to get off. So you might have to swing on them a bit. Those ones weren't too bad. Okay, caliper is off, and here are two brake pads. What amazes me about this is this caliper has not changed in design since the front disc brakes went on the 40 series Cruiser. And what was that, back in like 1981, 1982? Just unbelievable. Okay, the first thing we want to do is that there is the width of the current rotor. I'm going to be putting a brand new rotor in, so it's going to be a lot wider. And that's the width of the current pad. I'm going to be putting brand new pads in, and they'll be a lot deeper as well. So we want to push these brake pistons back as much as we can. We got two pistons here and two pistons here. And I've just got one of these giant bloody C clamps or G clamps or whatever you want to call them. And I just tighten this down. And as I tighten that, you can see it's pushing those pistons back inside of the caliper. And I'll do that until it bottoms out. That's got those two pistons run in. Now I'll go over to this side. That's it. That's got those two pistons run in. Just a word of advice. If you've got squealing brakes, oftentimes it means that one of these pistons is a little bit seized up inside of the bores. And what's happening is after the application of the brakes, it's not allowing those pads to pull back in marginally, so the pads stay contacted with the rotor. So if you've got that as an issue, that's one place to look, are these pistons. And you can get rebuild kits for these calipers. They're pretty simple to do. These are the front brake pads that I'm going to be using. They're a DBA product called Extreme Performance. There's your part number there. And they've got this little chart rating, I guess, where you got a street performance, extreme performance, and race performance. I'm not affiliated with DBA at all. I've paid full retail for these, but I have used their product in the past, and I quite like them. So that's the reason I'm going with them. It's something that I know. And of course, the other reason I'm going with them is because they're this awesome Chevy orange. And anything Chevy orange goes faster, doesn't it? Now, there's one thing that you need to watch out for. That's these squealers here. And what those are designed for is, as your brake pad wears, when the rotor contacts these little squealers, that's basically telling you that you need to replace your brakes. Of course, because you're a diligent mechanic, you don't actually allow your brakes to get down that far that these squealers contact the rotors, do you? No, of course not. And these squealers, just have a look at your original pads and find out where they're oriented. On mine, they're on this end of the caliper. Now this little spring here is designed to help push the pads back inboard of the calipers to minimize that squealing I talked about earlier. You just need to make sure that when you put your new pads in, you ensure this is put in place and that pin runs through them. To get these two pins out, which are holding these brakes in place, you've got this little fancy bit of wire. And that just pulls out like that. So there's holes in each of these pins where these two angles sit in, and this little guy here just sits in that hole on the caliper. You may have to get a pin punch and just persuade them a little bit. There's one. There's our second one. And now this spring clip here can pop out, and you can see how it works to push those pads back inside of the caliper. Now pulling these pads out is an enormously easy affair once you've done all that. They just slide straight out. And those pads that I've got on the front aren't in too bad shape. You can see the thickness of the new pad versus the thickness of the old pad. They're not too bad at all. Now depending on how rusty your calipers are, you may want to clean them up. Mine aren't too bad, so I'm going to leave them the way that they are. Now remember that squealer, you've got to get that oriented the same as the original pads. So for mine, it goes in like this. Now on this outboard pad, that one does not have a squealer, so just make sure that you grab the other pad that doesn't have a squealer. So you only get 2 out of the 4 pads with a squealer. Now normally with your brake pad kits you get this high temp lubricant, and where you're meant to put it is where the metal contacts metal. So for instance on these pads you'd put a little bit here and you'd put a little bit here on the piston mating face. I'm not a fan of this, however, and that's because I use the car in pretty extreme off-road conditions, and all of these lubricants do is they just attract dirt and sand and all sorts of crap. So in an off-road application, I don't actually use this stuff. I do use it on my street-going cars, but not in anything that I use in an off-road capacity. Now I'll start our 2 pins and remember which way they came out. Now this top pin we can drive all the way through. This pin, remember we need to put this guy in place. So he goes there and there. And we squeeze his girdle in. And just tuck him in place. Seated quite nicely. And now this guy goes in, and you may have to rotate these pins to get the holes to line up. Wire goes in one end. Rotate this one around as well. Wire goes in second end. And then this guy just pops in that hole. And that's it. Brake pads have been replaced on these front calipers. If you're not doing rotors, you're done here. You can bolt this caliper back up in place now. I'm going to be replacing the rotors as well, so let's jump into that step next. All right, you ready for the awe-inspiring methodology to take these rotors off? Ta-da! I know, eh? That's just sensational. Now the disc on the other side almost fell off. This one is not coming off. But Toyota give you these little handy dandy threaded ports, I guess you'd call them, where you can run a couple of bolts in and force the sucker off. What these bolts do is they just push on a flat on the backside and force the rotor off. Boom. And there it comes. Thank you, engineers. You did something right for us mechanics. Now I'm going to clean this mating surface up where the rotor mounts, just so that when I mount it, it doesn't have any run out because of some potential corrosion there. Now, when I was cleaning off this mating surface, I found this. I've never had the CVs replaced before, but that lends me to believe that this dust cap has been off before. So maybe there's been a CV replaced. Anyway, I want to pop that dust cap off and knock that back into shape, because that is a perfect area for shit to get in. It's proof positive that at least water has got in through that little hole. This end of the CV and inside of the hub is all corroded, so I'll need to clean that up before I go ahead and put this back on. Alright, now I'm going to spray this thread with a nice thick oil. because it's been corroded a little bit. And if I ever need to take this CV off, I want to give myself a fighting chance of getting that nut off. So that's remedial measure number 1. Remedial measure number 2 is a new cotter pin. Now remedial measure number 3, I penelopeted that back into a round shape, but it is a little deformed still. So I'm going to take a little bit of silicone and just pack that side of it so that I get a proper seal. I'm not going to go around the whole perimeter, just that spot there. All right, got our mating surface all cleaned up here now, so we can go ahead and install that rotor. Here's our front rotors. There's our part number again. It's a DBA product, the same as the pads. Awesome, I get a sticker. Ooh, look at that, 6A. This is kind of interesting. I've never seen anything like this before. Maybe it's a little bit of a sales gimmick, but anyway, it's got 3 temperature sensitive painted lines on here. This green one goes from green to white at 458 C. The orange one goes from orange to yellow at 550, and the red one goes from red to white at 630. So what they say is it allows you to monitor the temperature that the discs have been experiencing to tell you whether it's working within its rated tolerances. So that's kind of neat. I don't know whether I'll ever use it or not, but neat. At least something as simple as a disc brake rotor, companies are trying to innovate. So that's pretty cool. I respect that. Now they tell you in the instructions to clean the surfaces off with a bit of brake cleaner. And I like to use a white rag, just so that I can see whether anything's coming off or not. Yeah, a little bit, but not a lot. They're not super oily. And just out of interest, these rotors are 33 millimeters thick. The minimum specification for the stock Toyota rotors are 29 millimeters. Now, just because I was curious, I got the grinder and ground the lip off of either side of these rotors just to see what thickness these are. And these are the original Toyota rotors that were on the car. You got 190,000 kilometers on them. 31 millimeters, not bad at all. As I said, the minimum thickness is 29, so they still had 2 millimeters of life left on them. Let's get the DBA rotor and just make sure that they're the same diameter, which they are. All right, new rotor. Just like that. Put a pair of gloves on now so I don't get any oil from my hands on the rotor here. I know that's pretty anal. You don't need to do that, but hell, I had the gloves, so why not? Now we'll set our caliper back down in place. And it should slide straight over this rotor because we've pushed those pistons back into the caliper. Beautiful. Now we'll start our 2 bolts. And there's our bottom one.
Final point that I'd make on these brake pad replacements is that you don't actually have to take this caliper off. If you're able to push these caliper pistons back inside of the caliper, that means you only need to take off this spring, that spring, and these 2 pins. And when you do that, these brake pads will slide right out. I don't recommend that, however. I like taking the caliper completely off, and the reason for that is I can inspect the seals around the pistons and just inspect the general inside condition of the caliper itself. But if you like shortcuts, that is one way that you can do this and shave off even a little bit more time on what's a pretty simple job.
Now these front brakes are basically finished. If you were just swapping out pads, you would be done now. Then you can make the choice as to whether you're going to bleed the system or not, or whether you're just going to use the fluid that's in there. My recommendation, of course, would be to bleed the system and get fresh fluid in there, but that's your call. Changing these pads out has probably taken me 15 minutes. It's a really simple job, really easy to do with simple tools. So if you've got a little bit of mechanical aptitude and a little bit of nous, give it a crack yourself. Where we're going next is to the rears, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on the rear brakes. Replace the pads and replace the rotors. They, however, are a little bit more complicated than the fronts because they house the rear handbrake. In terms of fluid that I've drained out of the system, I pulled an initial 350 mil out when I used the succulator, and I've got an additional 500 mil here that I've allowed to drain out through gravity and that I pushed out of the pistons and the calipers. So that's 850 mil all up that I've taken out of the front system. We'll now jump into the rear. I'll empty this out and we'll measure the volume I pull out of the rear. Now we're onto the rear brakes. There is no way to change the rear brakes without taking the calipers off, so they have to come off. And we've got two 17mm bolts holding them on, same as the front. Need a breaker bar for that one. Whew. That's got him. That bottom one is always the one down in all the shit. So it's going to be the hard one, if any of them are. And off comes our rotor. Now that rotor's not pulling off, and it could be for a couple of reasons. It could be because this is rusted up around here and it's full of crap, or it could be because the handbrake shoes, which sit inside of here, are bound up on the drum itself. I can feel that that's not the case, but if it were, you back the handbrake shoes off by using a screwdriver in this little hole. And once I get this off, I'll explain how to do that and you'll be able to see it quite clearly. However, to get these off now, I'm going to go back to the old bolts, which I had to use on the front, and we'll do the exact same thing. These bolts run down, they hit a mating face, and they push the drum forward. And here comes the disc drum now. Voila. Well, you guys are going to get a little bit more of a how-to lesson than I first anticipated. So what I've noticed immediately when I pulled this off are these rear shoes, which are the handbrake shoes, are toast. See how thin that is? They're due for replacement. I haven't purchased a pair of these shoes, so that's going to pull me up until I get a new pair. So that's one thing that I've noticed. Secondly, I'm replacing these disc/drums anyway, but one thing that jumped off the page to me immediately is how rooted that internal surface is on the drum where the handbrake shoes run up against. And I suspect the reason for that is a couple of fold. First of all, crap gets in there and it doesn't get out and you can't really wash it out. Secondly, I never actually used the handbrake because the bloody thing doesn't work. And that is shown here because you can see that it's all rusted and corroded. Okay, well let me clean the rust up on this hub, replace the pads in that caliper, and that's going to pull me up until I can get some new shoes, handbrake shoes. Remember I said if that disc is bound because your handbrake shoes are hitting it and you've got to back these handbrake shoes off, this is what I was talking about. You stick that screwdriver in the hole in the drum and you lever it and you rotate this little wheel here and that'll pull the shoes in, allow them to clear the drum so that you can pull the drum off the face. Now just like on our front calipers, we're going to have to compress this piston. So again, I'm using that same clamp that we used on the front. Close that piston in. That's it, that piston's in as far as it's going to go. Now to fish out these brake shoes, you just push them out basically. There's a couple of little springed clips here that hold them in place. There's one, and there's our second one. Now unlike the front brake pads, there are no squealers on these, so they are identical. That means when you get your two new pads, it doesn't matter which one goes in which side, because they're the same. There's the part number for the rear brake pads. Those rear pads were definitely due for a change. Check out the thickness difference between the new one and the old one. Now to pop these in place, you've just got to relieve these spring clips a little bit and slide the shoes into the groove. Shoe number one is in place, and the second shoe has the exact same type retainers. And that's it. Both shoes are now in place, and it's as simple as that. That caliper is now ready to slide back over the rotor. There's the part number of the rear rotors. Rotor in place. Now we'll bolt our caliper back on. Slide him over like so. Start our two bolts. Get them nice and FT. All right, we got new brake pads front and rear. We got new discs/drums on the rear. We got no discs on the front. And in behind here, I've got new handbrake shoes. And that is our brake system fully installed. Now you're probably throwing bricks and small children at the screen at the moment and saying, whoa, 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 Terry, you didn't actually get into the handbrake replacement or the brake bleeding. What the? And I'm afraid you're going to have to tune into the episodes over the next 2 weeks for the handbrake replacement and the brake bleeding. For now, however, all I can say is keep the shiny side up, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye now.